like you all, I love to talk about Kyma, and I love to talk about sound, and I love to listen to sound. And the more I work with sound in my life, the more I realize how malleable and how important the details are, and what a wonderful medium it is. There's just nothing like it that will let you capture the delicacy and so on. What an important role sound plays in our life. Listening is the primary way that we understand our environments. There's only a couple of hours in the sleep cycle during which we are not listening. Otherwise, we're listening to 360 degrees. And it's also interesting to note that we, as human beings, it is impossible for us to pay attention to everything. That is, we hear only what we're really listening to, but that's only partially true, because at the same time, we're aware of everything that's going on around us. So we always track the environment, and I might be focusing on a conversation with you, but if someone whispers my name over in the corner, suddenly I turn around to see who it is. But seeing is kind of like information, and listening is what gives you a feeling about something. Now, having said that, I just do want to mention that Kyma is the most powerful, interesting instrument, you could say, in the broadest sense of the word, because I need to define it more, for working with sound. And that I still feel, with the best of products, and with greater and greater understanding of sound, that it's a little bit like we're doing brain surgery with a hatchet. That we will, as we begin to understand the nature of sound and have to change sound more and more, develop more and more tools. And my guess is that they'll appear in Kyma before they appear anywhere else. I would like to start with just a very interesting kind of example. Now, sound is our avenue towards understanding a lot of different things, and I'm very active with EMF in New York. And one of the programs is called Ear to Ear, and it's about environmental sound. And the initial idea of Ear to Ear was that people would get to know the earth through sound, and consequently become more aware of climate change. And it turns out that that is a little unnecessary now. Don't get climate change. Nothing's going to help. But in line with that, we have organized certain kinds of projects, and one of them is called New York Soundscape, making the sound. We already live in New York, and making the sounds of the city. And I'd like to just start with an example of a very interesting sound that I do not think could be produced with any other software, other than Kyma. This is called Manhattan Sounds. It's by Richard Lanehart, and it is available and done on the site by download. But I'm just going to play a moment or two of it, and then I'll just tell you a little bit about how it was done, and then we'll move on. So this is Richard Lanehart's Manhattan Sounds. Sorry, under normal, more relaxed circumstances, I would have worked out a fade out. But in any case, I'll tell you how we did it. In fact, I worked with him on this. I helped him do it. I did what he asked me to do, which is to take some field recordings that were done by one of our associates, Monique Sarah. They were mostly around 125th Street, Harlem. And she recorded subway stations and the entry to stores and street sounds and so on. And then Richard asked me to take the broadband sounds there and give them 2 minutes each of about 15 different sounds, which I did. And then he put them in a string, and he played his guitar, and through cross-filtering, through an analysis of his guitar sound applied to those New York sounds, he produced this. Isn't that extraordinary? It's really extraordinary. And there is no other way to do it than to take information from one place and use it to modify another. You certainly can't do it manually. Well, I'm going to play other examples, but I would like to move from sounds to composition, because as beautiful as sounds can be, one presents them normally in a composition. And I'd like to focus on a particular way that I think of working with Kyma. Of course, if one can make sounds, you can put them one after another in a timeline. You can sequence them in any way. My model is sort of a very simple example of it was Ben Burt, a YouTube Ben Burt, doing these sound cuts for Wally, sitting there with a Wacom tablet and following the robot's movements on the screen and playing these sounds from Kyma while he was working it. This is the way that, for me in any case, time passes most productively when using Kyma, which is to say it's really based on kind of performance. And my approach to composition is very much like that. I could say that Burt was really composing that sound. And I think the same thing. I think what we do with Kyma is to invent an instrument, and we use that instrument to compose. Now, Kyma is not an instrument. It's not a tool. A tool is a direct extension of some physical gesture that you have, and an instrument, in contrast with a tool, is interpretive, which is to say that we do something with an instrument and we interpret that in a different way to make sound. One of the most unhealthy examples of a musical instrument I know of is a violin, because you're holding it through scars. It's just terrible. I don't think I know any violinist that doesn't take acid. And a violin has three parts, typically of an instrument. It has the performance device, which is the strings of the bow, and it has the bridge. And it's called a bridge because, like a bridge, it passes from one place to another. And it takes information from the strings and then it sends them onto the sound box, and it resonates particular format frequencies in the sound box that never change. The format frequencies don't change, but as everything else changes in the performance device, you get very different kinds of sounds on the violin. But it has three components, and it's based on a model that is an exciter and a resonator, which is the model for, I believe, every acoustic instrument. At least I cannot think of any acoustic instrument that does not work that way, as an exciter and a resonator. Well, an instrument, then typical violin, is not only an exciter resonator, but it's that it has three parts. It has a performance device. It is something that communicates between the performance device and the sound generator. And it has a sound generator. Now, the interesting thing about electronic instruments is that there is no direct connection between the performance device and the sound generator. That is, any performance device can make any sound. And it's not an exciter resonator. That connection doesn't occur. So you can do anything. And the bridge, of course, can be a computer, it can be any kind of a translation or an interpretation of the performance device. You can stand on your head and shoot string beans. So long as you can convert that to MIDI signals, you could use that in performance. That's interesting, because that might be visual. Maybe you could produce interesting music. Now, what Kyma is not an instrument. Incident. It's certainly not a tool, and it's not an instrument either. What it is a kit. It's a kit for making an instrument. And so if you can imagine all of those pieces of software laid out on the table, you sort of choose the ones you want to and put them together to make an instrument. But remembering that an instrument is interpretive, and that what you want to come out at the end is a particular kind of result. What you want to do is to make the instrument that will produce the kind of function, the kind of performance that you want to do to achieve a specific kind of result. And boy, is that a problem in a situation where you can do anything. The question is what to do. And most people use conventional models. They come with of course what they don't want to do, and they start there. And so what I'm proposing is probably a slightly less conventional model, but it's one that I like, in particular because of the way it affects the human experience. So the first question that I would ask about an instrument is, what do you get out of that instrument? What does it do for me? And I have one kind of example here that I would like to play for you. Sorry if I don't want to play it here. And now I'm going to play a piece by Sanson. And this is very beautiful. And I hope you enjoy it. Oh, now, just to give you a little bit of background here. In 1921, a student in engineering in Moscow invented something that was later, his name was Leon Theremin, and his instrument later became called the theremin, but he played it for a group of Soviet socialist engineers. Lenin heard about it, and at the time Lenin defined communism as the power of the people plus electrification, because electricity was a major problem in Russia at the time. So Theremin went to Lenin's office, and Lenin played the theremin. He was probably the first and last head of state that actually played the theremin, but it turned out that he had some musical talent. And I think it was at that moment that Theremin became a Russian spy, or a very, very bad one. But he toured Europe, he toured Russia, he toured Europe, and arrived in New York in December 1927, and stayed for 11 years. He left, went back to Moscow in 1938. Now, also arriving in New York in 1927 was Clara Eisenberg. Clara Eisenberg, that was her sister, Nadia Eisenberg, playing the piano. She was a very, very well-known pianist. She taught at Juilliard and was one of the great pianists of her day. Clara was a violinist, and another violinist told me that one of the measurements of a violinist is that you know where to put your fingers. Well, Clara Rockman went far further. She met Theremin, she loved the theremin, and she became a theremin player and gave up the violin, and she knew where to put her hands. And this is just so extraordinarily difficult. I am in awe every time I listen to this recording, the perfection of the intonation, the nuance, and so on. She makes her fingers move through the air. There are YouTube videos showing her at work, and I recommend to everyone. So here's my question, and the reason I play this for you is, what is Clara getting out of this instrument? What is there for her? Well, I would say, to answer my own question, I would say that there's an enormous amount of satisfaction in personal expression in the way you play an instrument like that. And that it happens precisely because the instrument is what I would call deterministic. which is to say, you get out what you put in. When you play the piano, you play a key, middle C, you expect to hear middle C come back. In an electronic keyboard, of course, you might be in for a surprise. But in situations like this, you do something and you hear the result of your actions, so you feel as if you are completely in control. And the instrument gives you a beautiful sound and that satisfaction. And that's certainly true of violins and clarinets and all of the acoustic instruments that are completely deterministic in their reaction to a performance. Now, as we move, say, from left to right on this continuum, from an instrument that does what you tell it to do to an instrument that doesn't do what you tell it to do, there's the middle ground. And it's a middle ground of kind of complexity. And you might think of it something like conducting an orchestra, if you think of an orchestra as being an instrument, a big instrument. I forget who the conductor was at the Pittsburgh Symphony, who used to demonstrate his power by raising his eyebrow on the whole orchestra, bang! Just prearranged signal, but effective, but a very, very effective demonstration of how a conductor really conducts an orchestra. I just happened to be, I was looking at Ravel's La Valse on YouTube the other day, and Bernstein's performance of it, which I think is actually the best. And you can see how he is really playing that very complex instrument. Now, he is standing there, and Bernstein, in this case, he doesn't use a baton, other conductors do use a baton. But here what you have is, it is meant to be a very deterministic kind of relationship, that is that the orchestra is supposed to do what the conductor leads them in doing. And just because there are so many people involved and so many personalities, it's sometimes a little shaky in to that end. But on the other hand, hearing the Boston Symphony playing New York a while ago showed me what a disciplined orchestra can do and how magnificent that particular sound could be. Now, that is a type of control that is equivalent to fly-by-wire. And fly-by-wire is a phrase that's used a lot in aviation today. It's a very normal phrase among pilots. You ask the pilot, does this plane have a fly-by-wire system here? The chances are they would say no, unless it were a Boeing 777 or an Airbus 306 or something, 346 or something like that. But the issue is this. Let me tell it to you in the sense of the story. North of New York, there's the Adirondack mountain range. And there's a lake there, it's called Long Lake. And on Long Lake, there used to be a man there who was flying a World War I airplane. And this plane, he took people up for tourism to see the mountains from the airplane perspective. The plane takes off at 70 miles an hour. Its top speed flying at 70 miles an hour, lands at 70 miles an hour, and so on. So I drive faster than the plane flies. And he is controlling the whole thing with pedals for the rudder, with this for the engine, and with that kind of a steering wheel for the ailerons. And that's what he does. And it's all completely manual. Can you imagine flying a Boeing 777 manually? Of course you can. As an American Airlines pilot once put it to me, he said, I tell the computer what I want it to do, and it does what it thinks I want it to do. It's an example of pilot humor. So, that is what's called fly-by-wire, that there is a central control device, and that given certain situations and contexts, that information goes out to a multivariable situation and it controls it. There is context built into fly-by-wire systems, that is, they won't let the plane climb too slowly, and they won't let it dive too quickly, and so on. The rules are very much the same, and of course it's meant to be deterministic. You don't want any indeterminism in an airplane. You don't want the plane to be creative. You want the plane to do exactly what you want it to do, and yet it is a multivariable situation. The problem is controlling a multivariable situation, and a variable is an aspect of the system that can change. Variables always have values, so you can say this knob No, you can say that of an amplifier, the variable is loudness. And that the setting of the loudness is the value of that variable at any particular time. And you change that variable with control, which in the case of an amplifier is a knob. So you have a variable is something that can change. Variables have values. And you change the value of the variable with control of some kind. And the more variables you have, and the more they're organized in an interesting way, which is to say that some variables can be controls for other variables and so on. And you could have many things working in parallel or in some kind of interactive way. The variable's value can be changed. If you say, if this happens there, then change this, and so on. You can have it mixed in with human reactions. And so on. It gets interesting. And it brings up an issue of what I think of as a control hierarchy. Now, a hierarchy is not necessarily a question of big people telling little people what to do. Hierarchy is, think of a hierarchy as boxes within boxes. So that every time you open a box, you have more smaller boxes. And a hierarchy for the book is based on hierarchy, in that the book contains chapters, which contain paragraphs, which contain sentences, which contain words, which contain letters. And in a hierarchy, generally speaking, the meaningfulness of it happens really somewhere at the bottom, like the words in a book. And the words in a book don't want to go by too fast for us, but we can talk about different kinds of hierarchies. In the 1940s and early 50s, when system theory was at its point of discovery, the Navy, the U.S. Navy, commissioned several books on what they called command theory, echelon theory, and so on, but the Navy has very often been in a position of leadership in command structures. And the idea of a command hierarchy is that someone gives one command and that goes down a level and down a level and down a level. The example that I usually give, because it seems to me visually obvious, is of an old sailing boat with cross, with perpendicular spars. What do you call that? Square-rigged boat. So the captain says turn left, and that command goes down to the commissioned officers and to the non-commissioned officers, then to the department heads, then to the sailors, who all go up to the spars and start changing the sails around. So these commands filter down, and in that case, you can measure, you can, in fact, in an objective way, you could measure power. Power being the number of commands your command contains. So if you're the head of a company of 3 people, for example, it's questionable power, but if you're the head of a company of 5,000 people, you have that much more power. But the more powerful you are, the less you control the result. The less connection you have with the bottom line, which is where the guys are making the progress of turning the ship, doing whatever they're doing. And so power and control are really antithetical concepts. And an ideal power hierarchy, from my point of view, in a musical instrument is being able to move through that hierarchy and changing according to the way what you want to do at a particular time. One of the most frustrating, as another example, one of the most frustrating experiences I often have is with Microsoft Word. It tries to be so powerful because it puts punctuation where I don't want punctuation to be. It guesses what I'm trying to do, and I don't want it to guess what I'm trying to do. It appears to me to write a suicide letter. What we're looking for is an understanding then of control hierarchies. And at the same time, we can decide whether or not we want to be powerful or whether or not we want to actually control the music. Now, what I like to do in making an instrument is actually the third possibility, which is sort of at the end of the continuum from left to right, which is very indeterministic, but which is also very interactive. Now, by interactive is a word that's very often, I think, misused. It's used very often just to mean quick response. But that's not what interactive is. Interactive means mutually influential. And an example that's given usually of interactivity is shaking hands, where the 2 people involved are mutually changing position of your hands, and so on. It's a very interesting kind of analogy for interaction. I think it's really a very good one. But there are other kinds of, we think of interaction differently when we think of musical situations. For example, jazz players think of interaction as a conversation. And in a conversation, it's really, you're talking about an interaction between two people, each of which knows the other person. And so the idea in a conversation is that you listen to what's been said, and then you add to it in your response. And to the extent that you add to it, you're an interesting conversationalist. To the extent that you just repeat what's been told to you, you're a pretty boring conversationalist. In fact, in many cases, you can predict what's happening. To do it is pro forma. And you might as well not start the game in the first place, because you've already been there. So you want the unexpected to occur in an interesting conversation. But there's another kind of interaction also. And then incidentally, I should say that many composers employ this particular model of, you might say, of a conversation, or the model of the communication between two people that know each other. The other kind of interaction the model for it that I give, it's really a model of life, because you only have partial control of what's happening. But the example I give is sailing a boat through a windy sea, or sailing a boat in a windy sea. Now, I like sailing, and that's where I got the idea for this. I was doing it for years before I understood it, and I understood it off the coast of Kyma.mov, where I went out on a sailboat. It was a racing sloop. Important to know, because I've also been out on schooners that just sort of plow through the water, but the racing sloop chain, it's very nervous. It turns on a dime and so on. And so I was steering, and the owner of the sloop was incidentally 80 years old. They were his 40-year-old girlfriend. He was standing sure-footedly on the cabin as the boat was bouncing around, shouting orders back to me, saying, "Steer 180. So I try and steer 180. Of course, can't steer 180 in that kind of a situation with white caps and with the wind and the waves tossing around all the time. You try and steer 180, and then you suddenly find you're 240, so you compensate, and you find you're 160, and then you're always back and forth. And the way I sort of resolved that for myself was finding what I call a corridor of variation. A corridor within which you could say, okay, give or take a little bit, that this is the course you want to follow. And I could aim it at, say, the building on shore, or the compass, which is a very big compass, and so on. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Now, where is the interaction? What am I interacting with? And what I'm interacting with is the effects of the wind and waves on the boat. My goal is to keep the boat within that corridor of variation. And I only have partial control over it. So I'm interacting with all of those other forces that are keeping me off target, so to speak. And that is like an interaction with life. At any one point, there are forces that are acting on us that don't know us. They're not reacting to anything we do. They are under the surface. The committee's making decisions, or they're changing the tax code. Republicans changing the tax code, or anything of the sort that will affect our lives, but that they don't know us and they don't have any control over us. And so we have only partial control of our lives. And that's the kind of interaction that I use in music for Richard Langhoff, was because certainly the sounds of New York and understanding of what he was doing. And whenever you set up a very complex situation like that, you are there. Now, complexity is seeing unpredictability. If you can associate an effect with a cause, if you can say, that happened, and I know exactly why it happened, it's all very simple. And that is really the effort to make things simple. Is very often inaccurate, because most things do have a certain complexity. But we have to assume that things are simple. In order to fulfill an action, if you walk into a room, for example, through the switch, and the light comes on, you say, hey, I did that. But in fact, you didn't do that. There are multiple causes that are in effect. So a friend of mine, Francois Bell, who was the head of GRM in France for many years, was telling me about his boyhood in Madagascar. His father was a French foreign servant, and he grew up in a very rural part of Madagascar. And he was telling you, you know, that his friend would be bitten by a certain crab and die, and if he found a nail, they put it carefully in a box and kept it because there wasn't any hardware store around, and the social rank was in part reflected in the kind of oil that you got for your lamp, or the kind of meat you got when you killed the cow, and so on. And now if you imagine from that situation, just imagine that you walk out to the end of the island and you look across the Atlantic Ocean and you see the skyline of New York City, and you think, what does it take to be able to walk into a room and throw a switch and have the light come on? How many things are affecting that, the possibility of that particular action? And you get an idea of the kind of simplifications you have to go through to say, hey, I did that. But then if a farmer took into account all of the probabilities of the crop not coming up, would the farmer still plant the seeds? You always think, we're always optimistic, right? We're going to do this because if we do this, then something else is going to happen. Now, it's that kind of unpredictability that sometimes we think of as being random. That is, it's that complexity, I should say, that sometimes causes an unpredictability to think of. So when I'm talking about randomness or unpredictability, I usually choose as a model a provocative model, which is an Italian Renaissance in Florence. The city of Florence in the 1500s was ruled by the Medici family, bankers, and it was very prosperous compared to the other city-states in the Italian landmass. Florence was prosperous. They were manufacturers. They shipped a lot of things. They were traders, and there was a lot of extra money in Florence. So if you were a businessman who had some disposable income, you would want to show people by buying art, and consequently there was an artistic industry in Florence, and that industry took the form of numerous workshops that were headed by a maestro, and people, young artists, got their training in the workshops. You would be very fortunate if you would want to buy a painting from a workshop. For example, Michelangelo is one of the interns. So you'd go there and you'd say to the maestro, can I have a painting by Tuesday for Sony Rivera? And he would turn to his cohorts and say, what do you say, guys, when you do it? And they'd say, sure, boss. And he would then take the canvas and say, it should look like this, and they'd go to work. He'd come back an hour later and say, well, that's okay. It should be a little more blue here and that should be over there. He'd go away, come back a little later and say, you know, it's a little better, but we want a cloud over there, and we want this shade of color, and this over there, and so on. And then finally, the painting would be finished Tuesday, and he'd hand it over. Now, what I do with random number generators, I think of them as my workers. And I give them a job, a very clear-cut job, and I give them a corridor of variation in doing their job. And I tell them, okay, look, Alex, this is what I want you to do, and I'm going to come by. It's not that I'm going to come by later. I'm going to be watching you every minute at a time, and I'm going to change your activity if you get it wrong. And that is a kind of real-time control over all of your helpers, who of course do unpredictable things. I mean, even in the Renaissance, they would do unpredictable things because they were talented, and because they were supposed to think for themselves, because if they weren't thinking for themselves, the atelier would fold. I mean, how could the atelier get anything done if his workers were not talented and thoughtful and did their jobs well? And so all of those random numbers need to do their jobs well, too. And what that lets you do in working with Kyma, when you're working with random number generators within the compositional fabric, so to speak, you can control many, many variables at the same time. And if your instrument, which I recommend, is a multivariable instrument, there are many things that are changing. If you are building complexity into your instrument, things that you cannot control manually, and even if you could, probably wouldn't be very interesting because it would be so predictable. You are creating a very you are making a very creative environment with which you can interact. And interaction is like controlling. A little bit, you could say, like a conductor trying to control an improvising orchestra. And this is, in general, the way I work. Now, I'd like to play you a few different kinds of examples of it. And just to mention that in every case, the instrument I usually make is to start, involves random number generators that are assigned certain kinds of jobs, so that if I did nothing, something would happen. And when I do something, I try to get things done. I'll give you some examples of this, and then I'd like to come back and discuss this a little bit from another point of view. Actually, the first example that I'd like to give you is just an example of what random numbers can do, because it brings different things to different people's mind. And when I speak theoretically about random numbers, it's not necessarily always with a favorable reaction. So what I'm going to do is to play you a sound clip. This is not done with Kyma. This is done using a program called M. And I think you'll recognize the first thing that I'm going to play, but I'd like to play it for 2-3 minutes so that you get a sense of the tune. You probably heard this before, but I'm sure you wouldn't mind hearing it again. Can you hear that? Is the volume down? Actually, Gilberto singing Corcovado. That's Stan Getz. That's the Sean Gilberto.
Muita calma pra pensar e ter tempo pra sonhar. Da janela vejo.
I'm just letting this go through the first chorus so that you hear the whole tune.
Quero a vida sempre assim, com você perto de mim, até o apagar da velha chama. E eu que era triste, descrente desse mundo, ao encontrar você eu conheci. Porque a felicidade.
Now here's a version of it for Could you turn up the volume? an example that I often give of how pleasant randomness can be. And of course, what you want to do is make guesses at exactly what are the parts of this that are being randomized, parts of the rhythm and various other things. But you should certainly be able to make out the tune once you've just heard it beforehand. And it was random, and it wasn't so random, that they're both in the same key, and so on. So that I can use this easily as a kind of example. But it's a very, it's a kind of interesting example of randomness. I did this using a program called M, which is still available, and which pulls down with different kinds of patterns and so on. Now, I'd like to give you some other examples of pieces that I've done with Kyma, and just talk about them as examples of how they were done. So here is one. That is very often performed with flute. And the flute sounds like this. Now that flute is Patty Munson, and I wrote nothing. I just said, hey Patty, please play a few notes. And she did. And then in performance, a flute, not necessarily playing the same notes, would come through like this. There's no score, and there's really nothing to rehearse. So when a performer does it, I call it many times, and dot, 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 and the dot, dot, dot is the first name of the performer. So in this case, it would be many times Patty. And the idea of the many times is that one of the things that technology does is to expand your capabilities. So here, in that case, it's expanding your capabilities through layers of sound. But in this case, with Chris Mann, speaking of, Chris is an Australian, and I don't know quite what to call him, maybe a word artist, but he's not a poet, he's not a writer, he's a word artist. And he used to recite in his own words in concerts with this very exaggerated kind of high and low changes in frequency. So here's an example of Chris unwired. Now, Chris is an old friend of mine, and I wanted to do as many times Chris for him in a concert, and so what I did is to take little pieces of Chris's from all around the room so that they come out transformations of Chris many times, Chris all in space. Now that should never repeat. And in both cases, it is not, they are not, certainly not fixed compositions. That is, in fact, one might ask, what is it that I composed? Since there are no notes, there are no words, all there are really the sounds and the kind of process involved. And it is really, my idea here was that it was the voice, it was an analysis, that wasn't even an analysis of the voice, it was the voice itself that was really performing the piece at the same time that it was part of the material of the piece. So Chris learned pretty quickly that when he is high, that the probability is that the effects will be higher. The flutist understands that if you do an arpeggio, you get big sound. If you maintain long, soft sounds, you get long, soft echoes, and so on. So that you tend to control aspects of the texture of the piece in that way that nobody can predict it, and it will always come out different. And there's nothing to reverse when a flutist plays this. You just get it or you don't. So I say, forget rehearsal, we'll run through it for 20 minutes before the performance. And if you don't get it, well, do your best. And if you do, you'll have a good time. Now, I would like to play, there's one other composition that I'd like to play for you and talk with you about. It's a little, it's a certainly very complex piece in its conception as well as in its execution. But it's called One Word One. And this was done with a friend of mine in India, in New Delhi. So I asked, the concept of the piece was to represent two cities at different places in the world and use the sounds from both cities and sort of mix together in a different way. And I asked a friend of mine in Delhi to do some field recording. Well, it turns out that he wasn't a very good field recorder. So a lot of the stuff that he did wasn't very usable, but there certainly are some sounds in there from the Delhi marketplace and from a walk from that marketplace down the road to a square. But for the most part, the sounds are from New York and from the area around Lincoln Center on a particularly crowded Saturday afternoon. And there are a few sounds from other places. Now the question then is, how to do that? And what I did was to certainly take all the field recordings. At the same time, I had a recording of there was a restaurant in the West Village in New York that I used to go with many colleagues before they closed because of rent increases. With many colleagues from NYU. We went there every week. Sometimes I was there several times. We got to know the cook, the owner, the waiters and waitresses. We got to know everyone. One of the waitresses there was an aspiring actress. And she was very interesting to talk to. And I recorded her telling the story. And then kind of the story wasn't really interesting enough to present it as a New York story, but that the tone of her voice and the inflection of her voice was very interesting indeed. So I used that. I used an analysis of that, not only through a vocoder and cross filtering, to filter the sounds of Lincoln Center. Now, it took, I will say, a long time, and you have to imagine the process of doing this. There was complexity at every stage of development of the individual materials, not only the quality of the sound, but also the spatialization, also the speed with which things happen, and so on. So once I had many tracks of different processes, there was certainly Amy's voice who was controlling all of this, but there were also other elements involved. And the patches were fairly complex, and I couldn't run them all at once. So I got it down to like 10 tracks. And then what I was doing was preparing in certain parts of it, again, with greatly automated mixing in which I was presiding over the automation and interacting with it. And I think it took a week and maybe about 20 times until I got it to a point where I thought it was right. And where it got that kind of sound that I was looking for. Let me play this for you. Now, to summarize all of this, the idea is, and what I find in every case that I'm working with these kinds of structures, with these, is that every one of them is really the product of a kind of instrument. And ultimately, I'm playing an instrument, whatever the complexity is. But in playing the instrument, I'm really interacting with a lot of things that are happening automatically. And, very importantly, unlike, say, automation in Pro Tools, these are unpredictable processes. And so what we're really doing is, what I find so fascinating about it is the things happen that I didn't plan. In other words, the composition is becoming a kind of discovery. It's a discovery, it's experimentation, and it's learning a lot about sounds. Things happen that I wasn't able to predict beforehand, and then I go with the right view. Sometimes I don't like them or whatever. But the randomness in this case is very different from the way John Cage, for example, would articulate randomness. also is a discovery, but in a very, very different way. I don't think that John ever looked at randomness as being his assistance in creating a particular piece. Maybe he did, actually. We certainly talked about it in our, I don't recall because I was thinking about it exactly that way. But it leads me to one of the most important questions, which is when you can work with an instrument that can do anything, what you do, and how do you decide what you do? And from my point of view, most people, I just parenthetically pointing out why I think that's so important is because most people accept certain ways of working that they're used to, or that and they don't really go beyond that thought. So they use Kyma in a way that they would normally work with other kind of equipment or that work in the past. And certainly that is entirely understandable. But what I would suggest is a different kind of rigor, which is that once you have is that you compose as you're walking down the street, and that you're asking yourself, what do I want to do? And that you do this without any confrontation with technology, that you do this without thinking about technology. But in fact, remember the slogan here, and good for many things in life, is that you should never negotiate until you're sitting at the table. You should just decide what it is you want and not compromise. And so as you're walking down the street, you should think, well, this is the kind of piece I want to write. This is the theater of it. This is the point of this concept. And then go through the different kinds of thinking. Now, how can I do this? Now, what are the sounds going to be like? What sorts of technologies do I want to use? With the Chris Mann piece, for example, I could not use cross-filtering because cross-filtering produces too complex a sound, and what I wanted was a lot of smaller things happening and differentiable one from the other. With the flute piece, I couldn't use cross-filtering because it's just too broad that. And what I wanted was a sense of how these different layers move. Not only that, but I wanted something that was more harmonic in its sound. In other cases, I wanted different kinds of sounds that would interact with each other in different ways. But in this case, what I'm doing is portraying the power of the city. Now, there is an abstraction involved, because of course you can do field recordings of Lincoln Center on a crowded Saturday afternoon, and they would be very interesting. In fact, I appreciate very much the nature of city sounds. I think New York is just a fabulous place for sound. You can stand around and listen to any street corner all day in complete fascination if you pay attention to it. But there are abstractions involved, to give you a sense of that, just sort of to wrap up my talk. That there's a wonderful painting by Mondrian, and it's called New York Boogie Woogie. Now, Mondrian was a constructivist painting several decades ago, and he painted squares, and squares of different sizes, but always at a vertical or horizontal, were divided by black lines. This one, called Broadway Boogie Woogie, had little tracks in between the squares with a lot of yellow dots. And you could scratch your head wondering, well, why did he do that? And what does Broadway Boogie Woogie mean? And so on. And it was, for me, not an important mystery to solve, but a matter of curiosity. And I was in Holland visiting the Museum of Contemporary Art in Den Haag. And we were taken on a tour by the director of the museum, and that is where the original of this painting was stored. And I said, well, what's that about? And he said, it's a look at New York from a high-rise hotel room. Those little yellow dots are the yellow taxi cabs. And there's a grid system of the streets in New York City. And I thought, interesting. But what's interesting about it, thinking about it, is that it's an abstraction. What it does is take from New York a certain quality that it emphasizes. And that is very often what art does, that it takes qualities from a certain reality and directs your attention towards it. In fact, when working with city sounds, the definition of art that I'd like to use is to make the ordinary extraordinary. But this piece, called One World One, the last one is because I intended to have a series, but I haven't yet done one or two, is the idea is to abstract these kinds of sounds from New York, the idea here, and mix them in with New Delhi. And actually you can tell that the sounds are not New York sounds, for sure, when coming from New Delhi sounds. But the idea is that kind of an abstraction of it, so that it draws attention in this particular case. One could focus on many other things, but in this particular case, to the power of the city and the density of the sound, and so on. So, I don't think it could have been done any other way. I just cannot imagine that the materials of the sound could have been done without Amy's voice controlling the filters. I just can't imagine. And incidentally, I tried it with some other voices with slightly different results. Everyone's voice is different, everyone's face is different. Might be a thought for the day that the sound you hear as it goes around your head from ear to ear is unique to yourself, and that if you've heard those sounds with someone else's face, you hear them slightly differently. That was from research at EarCom. But anyway, given that thought, I could not, the things that I just happened to choose delivered certain kinds of things that I could not have done myself, that I could not have done manually. I could not have, the plane here is far, far too complex to fly with a few controls. So with this the system of multiple variables, all of which are happening at the same time, I thought I'd take information from another source, from the analysis of another source. I take it from random number generators, I take it from different things, and make all of the basic material interesting enough so that when I put it together, I'm really by that point, really putting together a very complex fabric of different kinds of possibilities and learning a lot and enjoying hearing things that I've never heard before in the process of learning. And to tell you the truth, I really don't know of any other system with which you can operate that way. So I think that's a very special thing for Kyma, and a very, very, very rewarding